David was 32 years old, and honestly, he'd stopped believing in fairy tale romances. Living in Seattle, working long hours as a software developer, his life had become a comfortable routine of coffee shops, coding, and the occasional awkward date that led nowhere. His friends had started settling down, getting married, having kids, and he felt like he was watching life happen to everyone else but him. It was a Thursday evening in October when everything changed. David had never been the type to attend cultural festivals, but his colleague had an extra ticket and practically dragged him along. The place was packed with people from all over the world, colorful stalls everywhere, music mixing together in this chaotic but beautiful way. He was standing near a food truck, debating whether to try something called Georgian khachapuri, when he saw her. She was standing alone looking at a display of traditional textiles, and there was something about her that made David's heart skip. She had this presence, like she belonged in a painting or a dream. Her features were striking, but hard to place, like she could be from anywhere and nowhere at the same time. When she turned and their eyes met, David felt his stomach flip in a way he hadn't experienced since high school. He walked over, trying to appear casual, even though his palms were sweating. They started talking, and her voice had this melody to it, an accent he couldn't identify no matter how hard he tried. When he asked where she was from, she smiled mysteriously and said her village was so remote that most people had never heard of it, somewhere in the mountains of Eastern Europe that didn't make it onto regular maps. Her name was Lucia, and talking to her felt like the easiest thing in the world. She had this way of looking at him like she could see right through to his thoughts, and somehow that didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like being understood for the first time in years. They talked for 3 hours straight, moving from the festival to a quiet coffee shop, then walking along the waterfront as the city lights reflected on the dark water. What struck David most was how different she was from anyone he'd met. She didn't pull out her phone once. She asked deep questions about his dreams, his fears, his childhood memories. When he made jokes, she laughed in this genuine way that made him feel like the funniest person alive. And her observations about the world around them were strange but poetic. She'd look at the rain and say it was the sky sharing its sadness so the earth could grow stronger. Who talks like that? They started seeing each other every day. David found himself rushing through work just to spend evenings with Lucia. She was always available, which should have seemed odd, but he was too caught up in the whirlwind to question it. She never talked about a job, but she always had money for coffee or museum tickets. When he asked what she did for work, she'd say something vague about family investments and change the subject so smoothly that he'd forget he'd even asked. There were little things that seemed unusual, but David explained them away. Lucia never seemed to feel cold, even when he was shivering in his jacket. She'd walk in the pouring rain without an umbrella and not seem bothered at all. Sometimes, she'd say things before he said them, finishing his sentences with perfect accuracy. He chalked it up to them being so in sync, so connected. Isn't that what people in love always said? That they could read each other's minds? One evening, about 3 months into their relationship, they were having dinner at his apartment. David had cooked pasta, nothing fancy, but Lucia looked at him with such warmth that he felt like he'd prepared a 5-star meal. The candles were flickering, soft music was playing, and in that moment, everything felt right. He hadn't planned it, but suddenly he was on one knee, pulling out a ring he'd bought 2 weeks earlier and been carrying around waiting for the perfect moment. Lucia's eyes went wide, and for a second David saw something flash across her face. It might have been surprise or maybe something else, something deeper and more complex. But then she smiled, and it was like the sun coming out. She said yes, but then her expression turned serious. She took his hands and said there was something he needed to understand. She explained that her family had very old traditions that were sacred and non-negotiable. If he married her, he would be marrying into these customs, and he would have to honor them completely no matter what they were. David, riding high on the excitement of her saying yes, agreed without hesitation. How strict could these traditions be? He'd dealt with cultural differences before. His best friend had married into a traditional Chinese family, and sure, there were some elaborate ceremonies, But everyone got through them fine. Lucia seemed relieved by his agreement, but she also seemed worried. She told him that her family was very close, closer than most families he'd ever encountered. They lived by rules that modern society had forgotten, rules that kept them connected and strong. David nodded, squeezing her hand, promising he would respect whatever her culture required. He loved her. That was all that mattered. The next few weeks were a blur of wedding preparations, though Lucia handled most of it. She was particular about everything, insisting the ceremony had to be done a certain way in a specific location with only her family present. When David suggested inviting his parents and friends, Lucia became genuinely distressed. She explained that outsiders couldn't witness the sacred rituals, that it would break the spiritual protection her family needed. David felt torn, but ultimately agreed. He told his parents he was having a small private ceremony and would host a bigger celebration later. They were disappointed but accepted it. His friends thought it was weird, but David was so obviously happy that they didn't push too hard. Looking back, David would realize this was the first major red flag he ignored. But when you're in love, you convince yourself that compromise is romantic, that making sacrifices shows how much you care. As the wedding day approached, David felt both excited and nervous. Lucia still hadn't told him much about her family. He didn't know how many siblings she had or what her parents were like. Every time he asked, she'd say he would meet them soon enough, that words couldn't prepare him for the experience of meeting them in person. That should have worried him more than it did. The wedding was set for a Saturday in late November. Lucia had arranged everything at a private property deep in the Cascade Mountains, about 2 hours from Seattle. David drove there alone, following GPS directions that took him further and further from civilization. The last 30 minutes were on a winding dirt road that made his car shake and groan with every pothole. When he finally arrived at the location, David felt his breath catch. It was beautiful in an eerie way. The property was surrounded by towering pine trees, and in the center was a clearing with a small wooden structure that looked ancient, like something from another century. The sky was overcast and mist hung in the air, creating this dreamlike atmosphere that made everything feel unreal. Lucia was already there, wearing a dress unlike any wedding gown David had ever seen. It was white but with strange silver patterns that seemed to shift when she moved. She looked absolutely stunning, but there was something in her eyes that seemed different. Nervous, maybe? Or was it sadness? Before David could analyze it further, she smiled and walked toward him, taking his hands. That's when he saw them. Her family. 7 people stood in a line near the wooden structure, all watching him with identical expressions of calm curiosity. What struck David immediately was how similar they all looked. Not just to each other, but to Lucia. They all had the same unusual eyes, the same graceful way of standing, the same ageless quality that made it impossible to guess whether they were 20 or 40. 3 appeared to be women, 4 appeared to be men, though even their gender seemed somehow ambiguous. Lucia introduced them quickly. Her brother Antonio, her sisters Isabella and Valentina, her cousins Rafael, Lorenzo, Gabriella, and Marco. They nodded but didn't speak, just kept watching David with those intense, knowing eyes. He tried to smile, to appear friendly and excited, but something about their collective gaze made his skin prickle. The ceremony began without any warning. There was no officiant, no traditional wedding march, none of the familiar elements David had expected. Instead, the family formed a circle around him and Lucia. They began chanting in a language David didn't recognize, something that sounded old and complicated, with sounds his throat couldn't have produced if he tried. They moved in synchronized steps, circling clockwise then counterclockwise, their movements perfectly coordinated like they'd practiced this dance 1,000 times. Lucia took David's hands and spoke vows in that same strange language. Her brother Antonio stepped forward and translated, but the translation didn't make much sense. Something about 2 becoming 9 and 9 becoming 1 flesh, 1 mind, 1 eternal circle. David wanted to ask questions but felt frozen, like speaking would break something important. The family continued their ritual, pulling out small metallic objects from their pockets. The objects looked like polished stones but seemed to glow faintly with an internal light. Each family member held one, and they pressed these objects together, creating this soft humming sound that made David's teeth ache slightly. Then came the part that David would replay in his mind for months afterward. Each family member approached him, one by one, and placed their hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. As they did this, they stared directly into his eyes, unblinking. And David felt the strangest sensation. It was like electricity, but not painful, more like energy flowing into him, making his heart race and his head spin slightly. When Lucia placed her hand on his chest, she was the last one, and the sensation intensified. He felt connected to something vast and incomprehensible, like touching a live wire that ran through all of them. The feeling passed quickly, leaving him dizzy and confused. Lucia whispered that it was done. They were married, and the family members all nodded in unison. There was no reception, no cake, no celebration. The family simply began packing up the ceremonial items while Lucia led David back to his car. She seemed relieved but also tense, like she was waiting for something to happen. David tried to ask about the ceremony, about what those words meant, but Lucia kissed him and said they would talk later. Right now, they needed to go home. David assumed they meant him and Lucia. He was wrong. As he started driving back toward Seattle, Lucia told him to wait. Her family was gathering their things and would follow in their own vehicle. David nodded, not thinking much of it. Maybe they were going to meet for dinner or something. But when they arrived at his house 3 hours later because of traffic, the family's van was already parked in his driveway. All 7 of them were standing on his porch. Each holding a suitcase, David looked at Lucia, confused. She took a deep breath and explained that in her culture, families stayed together for the first year of marriage. It was tradition, sacred and unbreakable. She'd mentioned he would need to honor her customs, and this was the most important one. Her family would be living with them for 12 months. David felt panic rising in his chest. His house had 3 bedrooms, but 2 of them were small and he used one as an office. There wasn't enough space for 9 people. He tried to explain this to Lucia, gently, not wanting to offend her family on their wedding day. But Lucia's expression changed, becoming almost desperate. She said he'd promised to honor her traditions. She'd made that very clear before accepting his proposal. Going back on that promise now would break their marriage before it even began. Her family stood silently on the porch, still holding their suitcases, still watching with those calm, knowing eyes. David felt trapped. He looked at Lucia, saw genuine distress in her face, and made a decision he would regret. He unlocked the door and welcomed them all inside. The family moved through his house like they already knew the layout, each person finding a spot as if they'd planned it in advance. They set down their suitcases, removed their shoes in perfect synchronization, and began arranging themselves throughout the space. David watched, bewildered, as his home filled with these strangers who were now apparently his family too. As evening turned to night, David hoped they would set up sleeping arrangements in the guest rooms. He was exhausted from the emotional weight of the day and looking forward to finally being alone with his new wife. But when he and Lucia headed to the bedroom, her family followed. David stood in the doorway of his bedroom, watching in disbelief as Lucia's family filed in behind them. Each person carried a sleeping bag, the kind you'd take camping, and they began spreading them out on the floor in a perfect circle around his bed. Nobody spoke. They just moved with this quiet efficiency, like they'd done this routine 100 times before. He pulled Lucia aside into the hallway, keeping his voice low. This was too much. He'd agreed to let them stay in the house, but surely they didn't expect to sleep in the same room. That was crossing a line. There had to be boundaries, right? This was his bedroom, their bedroom, the one place where a married couple should have privacy. Lucia's face went pale. Her hands started trembling and she grabbed his arm with surprising strength. She explained in a shaky voice that the sleeping arrangement wasn't optional. In her culture, the family had to remain within sight of the newlyweds during the entire first year. It was about bonding, about creating an unbreakable connection. Without this constant proximity, something called separation sickness would occur. David had never heard of separation sickness. Lucia described it as a condition where newly married individuals from her culture would become physically ill if separated from their family unit. Fever, chills, weakness, even death in extreme cases. Her people had been following this tradition for generations to prevent it. The first year was critical for stabilizing the spiritual and physical bonds of marriage. It sounded absurd. David wanted to argue, to insist this was just superstition, but Lucia looked genuinely terrified. Her eyes were filling with tears and she was breathing quickly like she might have a panic attack. He'd never seen her like this. Part of him wondered if this was emotional manipulation, but another part saw real fear in her expression. He agreed to try it for one night. Just one night, and then they'd figure something else out. That first night was the longest of David's life. He lay in bed with Lucia beside him, acutely aware of 7 other people arranged in a perfect circle around them. He could hear them breathing, slow and steady, all of them settling into sleep at almost the same moment. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the alarm clock, and David stared at the ceiling, feeling like he was in a strange dream he couldn't wake up from. Every time he shifted position, he felt like they could all hear it. The idea of being intimate with Lucia was completely impossible with her entire family right there. He tried to hold her hand, to feel some connection to his new wife, but even that felt awkward and observed. Eventually, exhaustion won, and he fell into an uneasy sleep. When David woke up the next morning, he was alone in bed. He sat up quickly, looking around the room. All the sleeping bags were empty and neatly rolled up in the corner. He could hear sounds from the kitchen, voices speaking in that strange language, the smell of coffee and something else he couldn't identify. He found them all in his kitchen, moving around each other with practiced ease. They'd already made breakfast, though David hadn't given anyone permission to use his food. The table was set for 9 people, and they all turned to look at him simultaneously when he entered. It was like one person controlling multiple bodies. They smiled in unison, and Antonio gestured for David to sit. David tried to establish some normalcy. He thanked them for breakfast, attempted small talk, asked about their plans for the day. They answered politely but vaguely. No, they didn't have jobs to get to. No, they didn't need to run any errands. They would be staying here in the house today and every day for the next year. When David mentioned he had to go to work, they all nodded but made it clear that Lucia would be staying home with them. The days began to blur together. David would go to work, spend 8 hours in meetings and writing code, and return home to find all 8 of them there, waiting. They were always polite but present, constantly present. They never seemed to leave the house. David never saw them step outside, not even to get fresh air or check the mail. The food situation became bizarre. David's grocery bills tripled within the first week. The refrigerator and pantry would be full one day and nearly empty the next. But here's the strange part. David never actually saw any of them eating during normal mealtimes. When he ate breakfast, lunch, or dinner, they'd sit with him at the table, but their plates always had tiny portions that they'd push around more than consume. Yet the food was definitely disappearing. David started to suspect they were eating at night after he fell asleep. He tried staying up late to catch them, but exhaustion always won. The combination of stress and the bizarre sleeping arrangement was destroying his sleep quality. Then there were the stranger observations, things that made David question his own sanity. The family members seemed to share thoughts, not just finishing each other's sentences, but knowing things they shouldn't know. Isabella would start answering a question before David finished asking it. When he told Lucia a story from work, her brother Antonio would react as if he'd heard it too, even though he'd been in another room. One afternoon, David was in the garage looking for some tools when he accidentally hit his thumb with a hammer. It hurt badly and he cursed loudly, shaking his hand. When he went back inside, all 7 family members were rubbing their thumbs in the exact same spot where David had injured himself. When he pointed this out, they stopped immediately and looked away, like children caught doing something they shouldn't. The synchronization was everywhere once David started noticing it. They'd turn their heads in the same direction at the same instant, as if hearing something he couldn't. They'd reach for things simultaneously, move out of doorways at the exact same moment, even breathe in matching rhythms when they sat together. 2 months into the marriage, David's patience was reaching its breaking point. The lack of privacy was affecting everything. He couldn't have a private conversation with Lucia because someone was always nearby, always listening. He couldn't have any intimacy with his wife. Even simple things like watching a movie felt strange with 7 other people arranged around them on the floor, all watching the screen with identical expressions. His work performance started slipping. He was constantly tired, distracted, unable to focus. His boss noticed and asked if everything was okay at home. David didn't know how to explain his situation. How could he tell anyone that his wife's family had moved in and refused to leave them alone for even a moment? He tried talking to Lucia about it multiple times, but each conversation ended the same way. She'd become distressed, start trembling, and within minutes would develop physical symptoms. Her skin would turn pale, she'd start sweating, and once she even fainted. The moment David backed down and said the family could stay, her symptoms would vanish like they'd never existed. David started researching online, looking for any information about cultures with similar traditions. He found nothing that matched what he was experiencing. He tried finding information about Lucia's supposed village, but every search came up empty. It was like the place she'd described didn't exist. The bedroom situation was taking a serious toll on his mental health. Every night, 7 people arranged themselves in that same perfect circle. David had tried counting, and they always positioned themselves at exactly equal distances from each other, forming a geometric pattern that seemed too precise to be accidental. But the worst part was what he witnessed late at night. David suffered from occasional insomnia, especially now with all the stress, and during these sleepless hours he'd notice something disturbing. Around 2 or 3 in the morning he'd wake up and see that everyone's eyes were open, not just open, but glowing faintly with this blue light like they had tiny LED bulbs behind their pupils. They'd all be staring upward at the ceiling, completely still, not blinking, and they were making sounds, soft humming noises that harmonized into one frequency. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, like hearing music that wasn't meant for human ears. David would lie there frozen, afraid to move, watching the scene that seemed impossible. The first time it happened, he convinced himself he'd been dreaming. But then it happened again, and again, always at the same time, always the same pattern. He tried recording it on his phone once, but when he checked the video later, the screen was completely black and the audio was nothing but static. One night, David decided he'd had enough. He waited until the glowing eyes ritual started. Then he sat up in bed and spoke directly to them. He demanded to know what was happening, what they were doing. The humming stopped instantly. All 7 heads turned toward him in perfect unison, those glowing eyes fixing on his face. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Lucia sat up beside him and her eyes were glowing too. She reached for his hand and her touch was ice cold. In a voice that sounded different, layered somehow like multiple people speaking at once, she said, "You're not ready to understand. Go back to sleep, David." And here's the thing that frightened him most, he did. Despite every instinct screaming at him to stay awake, to run, to do something, his eyes grew heavy and he laid back down, falling into a deep sleep within seconds. When he woke the next morning, he questioned whether it had been a dream, but the memory was too vivid, too clear. David decided he needed outside help. He couldn't talk to friends or family without sounding completely insane, so he contacted a private investigator. He paid cash and met the investigator, a woman named Rodriguez, at a coffee shop far from his neighborhood. He showed her pictures of Lucia and her family, gave her what little information he had about where they supposedly came from. Rodriguez said she'd look into it and get back to him in 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were the longest of David's life. He went through the motions at home, pretending everything was fine, but he felt like he was living with strangers. More than that, he felt like he was living with something pretending to be human. The family never argued, never disagreed, never showed individual preferences for anything. When David asked what they wanted for dinner, they'd all say the same thing at the same moment. When he turned on the television, they'd all watch with the same level of interest regardless of what was on. It was like observing a hive mind operating multiple bodies. During this time, David noticed he was changing too. Sometimes he'd know what Lucia was about to say before she said it. He'd wake up from dreams that felt like memories that weren't his, scenes of places he'd never been, conversations in that strange language he shouldn't understand but somehow did. Once, he cut himself while chopping vegetables, and before he even felt the pain, all 8 of them gasped and touched their fingers in the same spot. That's when David realized the connection wasn't just between them. It was including him too, slowly but surely, pulling him into whatever they were. When Rodriguez finally called, David met her at the same coffee shop. She looked uncomfortable, even scared. She slid a folder across the table and told David that this was the strangest case she'd ever worked on. The folder contained her findings, and they were impossible. There were no records of Lucia before she appeared in Seattle 9 months ago. No birth certificate, no passport, no digital footprint of any kind. It was as if she'd materialized from nothing. The same was true for all 7 family members. Even stranger, Rodriguez had used facial recognition software and found matches to missing person reports. David's hands trembled as he looked through the folder. Rodriguez had printed out missing person reports from the past 5 years, each one showing people who'd vanished without a trace. The faces staring back at him from those pages looked eerily familiar, not because he recognized them specifically, but because they all shared certain features with Lucia and her family. The same unusual eyes, the same hard-to-place features, the same ageless quality. According to Rodriguez's research, these missing people had all disappeared from the Pacific Northwest region. 7 different cases across 3 years, and each person's last known contact was with an attractive stranger they'd met at a public event. The descriptions varied, but certain elements remained consistent. The stranger had an unusual accent, was vague about their background, and was intensely charming. But here's what made David's blood run cold. The last page in the folder was a missing person report filed 3 weeks ago, and the photo was of him. His own face stared back at him from a police form. His parents had filed it after they couldn't reach him for 2 weeks and found his house empty when they'd driven down to check on him. Rodriguez explained that she'd gone to his house yesterday afternoon while he was at work. She'd knocked on the door, seen movement through the windows, but nobody had answered. She'd looked through the windows and seen people inside, but the house had felt empty somehow, like looking at a stage set. When she tried calling the number David had given her, it went straight to a voicemail box that was full. David pulled out his phone to show her it was working fine, but when he looked at the screen, he saw dozens of missed calls and texts from his parents, his friends, his workplace, all of them asking where he was, if he was okay, saying they were worried. The dates on these messages ranged over the past month, but David had no memory of seeing them before. He checked his call log and saw that his phone had been receiving calls, but somehow he'd never heard them ring. Rodriguez leaned forward and said something that confirmed David's deepest fears. She'd done surveillance on the house for 3 days. During that entire time, nobody had left the building. Not for work, not for groceries, not for anything. The lights would come on and off at regular intervals. She'd see movement through the windows, but it was like watching a loop. The same patterns repeated every day, every night, like a recording playing over and over. David felt reality tilting. He tried to remember the past 2 months clearly, but the memories felt fuzzy, like looking through frosted glass. How had he been going to work every day if Rodriguez was saying his workplace had been trying to contact him? How had time been passing? Rodriguez had one more piece of information. She'd shown Lucia's photo to experts in cultural anthropology and linguistics, including the description of the language used in the wedding ceremony. 3 different experts had independently suggested the same disturbing possibility. The language sounded like reconstructed Proto-Indo-European, a theoretical ancient language that linguists believe existed thousands of years ago, but had never been recorded or spoken by anyone alive. David left the meeting feeling like his mind was fragmenting. He drove home on autopilot, and when he arrived, everything looked normal on the surface. His house, his car in the driveway, the lights on inside. But something was different. He could see it now, like Rodriguez had given him new eyes. The perfection was too perfect, the normalcy too rehearsed. He walked inside, and they were all there, sitting in the living room exactly where he'd left them that morning. Lucia smiled and asked how his day was, but David didn't answer. He stood in the doorway and asked the question he'd been avoiding for months. "What are you?" The room went silent. 8 faces turned toward him, and for the first time he saw their expressions shift into something that wasn't quite human. The masks they'd been wearing seemed to slip just for a moment, revealing something beneath that David's mind struggled to comprehend. Lucia stood up slowly. She told him it was time for the truth, that he'd progressed far enough in the bonding process to understand. She and her family weren't from Earth, at least not from Earth in the way David understood it. They were exploratory consciousness, beings from somewhere else that existed in collective form, not as individuals like humans. They'd come to study humanity, specifically to understand concepts like love, marriage, and individual bonding, which were completely foreign to their nature. In their natural state, they existed as one shared mind distributed across multiple forms. The idea that humans operated as separate, isolated consciousnesses fascinated and confused them. The wedding ceremony hadn't been a traditional marriage. It had been an integration ritual, a way of slowly merging David's consciousness into their collective. The constant proximity, the sleeping arrangements, all of it was designed to break down the barriers of his individual mind and fold him into their shared awareness. In their culture, marriage meant literal unity, becoming one being instead of two. David felt sick. He asked why they'd chosen him, why they'd done this. Lucia's expression shifted into something that might have been sadness, though David wasn't sure if what he was seeing was genuine emotion or an approximation of it. She explained that they needed to understand human bonding from the inside, to experience it fully, and the only way to do that was through complete integration with a human consciousness. The process was supposed to be complete by now. David should have already lost his individual identity. His sense of self should have dissolved into their collective, but something had gone wrong. Or maybe something had gone right, depending on perspective. Lucia admitted that during these months together, something unexpected had happened. One part of the collective, the part operating through the form called Lucia, had started to separate. It had developed what could only be described as individual feelings for David. This wasn't supposed to be possible for their kind. But the extended exposure to human consciousness had caused a mutation, a glitch in their collective unity. She was becoming individual, and it terrified her. David's mind was reeling, but he forced himself to focus. He asked what would happen now, whether he could leave, whether he could go back to being fully human and separate. Lucia shook her head. The integration had progressed too far. If he tried to leave now, he would experience the same separation sickness she'd described because it was real. His consciousness was already partially merged with theirs, but there was another option, one that Lucia had been secretly preparing. She could complete her separation from the collective, become fully individual like David, fully human in consciousness if not in origin, but it came with a price. The rest of the collective would have to leave Earth, return to wherever they came from, and Lucia would never be able to reconnect with them. She would be truly alone for the first time in her existence, and David would have to choose. He could accept the full integration, let his identity dissolve into the collective and exist as part of their shared consciousness forever. He'd lose himself but gain a kind of immortality and connection beyond anything humans normally experienced. Or he could accept Lucia's separation, let her become individual for him, knowing it would condemn her to the isolation and mortality of human existence. The third option was to refuse both. But refusing meant being trapped in this in-between state, not fully human and not fully collective, living in this house with them forever because his partially merged consciousness couldn't survive separation. David looked around the room at the 7 other members of Lucia's family. They were watching him with those strange eyes, and for the first time he could sense something of what they were thinking. He could feel their confusion, their curiosity, and their absolute certainty that individual existence was a form of suffering they couldn't comprehend why humans would choose. Lucia held out her hand. She told him she understood if he couldn't make this choice, that what she was asking was unfair, but she'd experienced something through him that her kind had never known. The desire to be with one specific being, the willingness to sacrifice everything for that connection. She called it love, though she admitted she might not fully understand what the word meant. The story ends with David standing at this impossible crossroads, facing a decision that would define not just his future but his very existence. Become something beyond human, let the woman he loved sacrifice everything to be with him, or remain trapped between 2 worlds forever. There were no good options, no clear answers, just the reality that his life had become something impossible, and he had to choose which impossibility he could live with.